In the summer of 1943, the ground at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, trembled under the force of two enormous propellers. On the test field, engineers stood with their arms crossed, gazing up at the grey sky. In the midst of that scene was a flat, silver object that looked nothing like any aircraft ever built. Its body was round like a disc, with two propellers attached at the edges and a stubby tail that seemed cut short. Inside the cockpit, engineer Charles Zimmerman bent over to check the oil pressure one last time. He knew he was about to witness something many had declared impossible. Zimmerman was not a pilot, but a dreamer among engineers. Since 1940, he had said that an airplane doesn't need to run, it only needs to lift. The remark made many US Navy officers laugh. In a world where everything depended on runways, the idea of vertical takeoff sounded like a joke. But he believed that if birds could hover in the wind, airplanes could too. So he built what his colleagues called the V-173 Flying Pancake, the first flying pancake in aviation history. That morning, winds from Chesapeake Bay blew strongly. Two Continental A-80 engines, each 80 horsepower, roared as Zimmerman signaled to test pilot Boone Guyton. The metallic sound echoed off the concrete walls, like the noise of an engine from another world. The propellers began to spin, vibrations spreading across the ground. A soldier, taking notes, stood at a distance, gripping his logbook tightly, sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold wind. In the first few seconds, the flying pancake shook like a giant creature trying to learn how to breathe. Pressure rose, and the aircraft began to lift off the ground 30 centimeters, then 60, then nearly 1 meter. Suddenly, the engines faltered. One propeller tilted off balance, the body lurched, and the 5-ton mass of metal crashed down. The impact echoed across the field, dust rising in a thick cloud. The group fell silent. Only the sound of wind sweeping over the ground remained, carrying the smell of burned fuel and oil. Boone Guyton opened the cockpit door, stepped out, and raised his thumb. He smiled while Zimmerman stood still. In his eyes, there was no disappointment, only the focus of a man who had just seen proof that his theory could be real. A dream once deemed insane had just lifted off the ground. "It lifted," he said softly. "And that's all that matters." According to the records of the Naval Air Experimental Board, the first test lasted 14 seconds. Not long, but enough to prove that the opposing propellers could generate a lift stable enough to keep the body airborne. It was the first time humans had witnessed a heavier-than-air, fixed-wing machine take off vertically without a runway. It rose like a kite, Guyton wrote in his report. But it wanted to be a bird. As the sun climbed higher, the shadow of the flying pancake stretched across the oil-stained concrete. A young engineer hastily scribbled in his notebook, "Vertical lift possible," a small phrase, yet it marked a turning point in aviation history. In the distance, P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds still screamed across the sky symbols of speed and power, but Zimmerman stood there, looking at his misshapen machine, knowing that the next race would no longer be on the runway but in the air itself. By dusk, the engineering team dispersed, leaving Zimmerman alone with the tilted aircraft. He walked around it, running his hand along the chipped propeller edge. His eyes glimmered with a strange light, not hope, but recognition. "We made it jump," he said, half to himself. In the silence of the test field, the faint sound of metal contracting echoed like the sigh of a creature newly born. Later, many recalled that test with a tone of wonder. According to engineer Thomas Reed, who filmed that day, the sky had been eerily still. You could hear your own heartbeat when it lifted. He said in a 1978 interview, the yellow light reflecting on his old glasses. He paused, smiled, and in that silence the impossible felt real. Oh, from that moment, a new chapter of aviation began. The question was no longer, can it fly, but how can it take off anywhere? On the cold ground of Aberdeen, the dream of vertical flight had awakened trembling but alive, like the first heartbeat of a mechanical life. In 1943, while US Navy engineers were testing the flying pancake at Aberdeen, The rest of the aviation world still believed in one fundamental principle: speed generates lift. The doctrine lifted by speed, not by thrust, had become so deeply ingrained that it served as the gospel of every flight school. Every design began with the same equation, the same conviction. An airplane had to accelerate fast enough along a long runway to take off. Pilots were trained to believe that only velocity could overcome gravity. According to the 1943 U.S. Army Air Force's training manual, a medium-class aircraft such as the P-47 Thunderbolt required at least 1,200 meters of runway to reach a safe takeoff speed. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress needed 1,800 meters. Early British and German jet prototypes, with still unstable turbine engines, needed nearly 500 meters more. These figures made deployment tactics rigid. Each mission required vast space, flat terrain, and perfect weather. In wartime, such conditions were rarer than gold. During bombing campaigns over Europe, American pilots witnessed what they called the curse of the runway. When thick fog rolled in or runways were shelled, hundreds of aircraft sat idle, engines screaming in vain. According to statistics from the 9th Air Force, in February 1944 alone, over 180 missions were cancelled simply because runway conditions did not meet takeoff standards. "We had the sky," one pilot wrote in his memoir, "but the ground kept us prisoners." In stark contrast to that anxiety, Nazi Germany poured all its resources into absolute speed. Under the hands of Ernst Heinkel and Willy Messerschmitt, they created the Me-262, the world's first jet-powered aircraft. With a top speed of 870 kilometers per hour, it outpaced every Allied plane of its time. Simultaneously, they developed the V-1 flying bomb, launched from fixed sites in France and the Netherlands, carrying an 850 kg warhead. The two programs consumed over 500 million Reichsmarks, an amount equivalent to nearly 5 billion USD today. Yet they made a doctrinal mistake. Every German flying machine depended on long runways and fixed infrastructure. Once the Allies gained air superiority, those runways became easy targets. According to RAF intelligence reports, in August 1944, during just the first 3 weeks of the Normandy campaign, over 60% of German jet aircraft were destroyed before they could even take off. Many Me-262 seconds were bombed while still in their hangars, and V-1 launch pads were flattened by B-26 Marauder raids. They built jets to rule the air, one British officer noted in his journal, but they never learned how to leave the ground. Amid the brutality of war, the idea of the long runway became a symbol of impotence, a sophisticated technology imprisoned by obsolete thinking. Across the Atlantic, the US military began to recognize the limits of that mindset. The Pacific Theater, with its narrow coral islands and aircraft carriers serving as mobile bases, forced a new way of thinking. Long runways were a luxury. At Tarawa, Saipan, or Iwo Jima, the runways were barely long enough for a single F-6F Hellcat to take off, and if the wind shifted, the pilot's only option was to crash into the sea. Naval officers called this situation runway starvation. According to the Pacific Fleet Operations Report 1944, for every 10 aircraft that took off, an average of 1 had to abort due to wind direction or runway damage. As landings advanced deeper into Japanese territory, distance and terrain made constructing new runways nearly impossible. The wartime world resembled a flat earth of flight, a place where all lift was trapped in a single plane. Within that context, Charles Zimmerman's ideas began to gain renewed attention. Once dismissed as the dreamer, he became the man willing to ask what no one else dared. What if planes didn't need the ground? Some young officers at the Naval Air Test Center began secretly supporting research into short takeoff and vertical landing. A dream of hover began to take shape not out of romanticism, but out of survival. As combat reports from Europe arrived, recording thousands more aircraft destroyed on their runways, engineers came to understand that the runway was no longer the foundation of the sky, it was its weakness. They did not need more speed, they needed flexibility. In the laboratories of Naka Langley, amid the hum of fans and the scent of metal, people began to discuss a future in which aircraft could take off from any patch of ground, even from a small ship deck at sea. And in that room, Zimmerman quietly wrote in his notebook, "The next war will be won by whoever learns to rise without running." That sentence later became the motto of a new generation of engineers. From the failures of the Me-262 and the charred runways of Normandy, they learned that true progress did not lie in flying faster, but in flying freer. In the flat world of old aviation, a small seed had been planted, the seed of the vertical lift idea, ready to break every limit that war had imposed. Before moving to the next section, if this story resonates with you, please like and share so more people can see it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every word from you is the motivation for us to create more great videos. Charles Zimmerman was born in 1908 inches, Pennsylvania, into a family of mechanics working for a local ironworks. While other children dreamed of becoming pilots, he spent hours sitting beside his father, mesmerized by the gears and bearings spinning under the red glow of the forge. In 1929, after graduating from a technical university and spending years as an engine repair worker, Zimmerman joined the Naka Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, the research institution that would later become NASA. At a time when America still placed its faith in long wings and longer runways, he began asking the question that unsettled many: why must a plane need a runway at all? From the perspective of an experimental engineer, Zimmerman never saw airplanes as romantic symbols. To him, they were a pure physics problem, an equation between lift and drag. He spent hours in the Langley wind tunnel, observing how air separated along the wing's edge, recording by hand each minor shift in pressure. "If birds can hover, so can we," he wrote in his notebook in 1938, after watching a heron hold its position against the coastal wind of Virginia. From that moment, he believed humanity could build a machine capable of remaining motionless in the air without a takeoff run. In 1940, when many pilots died during training in Florida and Texas because they lacked sufficient runway length, Zimmerman became haunted. According to internal statistics from the Army Air Corps, there were more than 230 accidents within 10 months, most caused by aircraft failing to reach takeoff speed. One afternoon, while watching a BT-13 crash just a few hundred meters short of the runway, he told a colleague, "They died because we refused to rethink the ground." That statement later became the spiritual cornerstone for an entire generation of young Langley engineers. Zimmerman began developing a new principle. Instead of increasing flight speed, increase the volume of air displaced vertically. He experimented with small-scale models featuring short wings and edge-mounted propellers, placing them in a wind tunnel reaching 160 kilometers per hour. The resulting airflow generated enough lift to raise the model off the test bench. Other scientists laughed, calling it merely a game with pressure. But Zimmerman saw something different, a mechanism that could transition between vertical and horizontal flight. He called it the tilt concept, an idea that would later form the foundation for all VTOL, vertical take, off and landing, designs. He was not a man of many words. During meetings at Langley, Zimmerman often sat silently, rolling a pencil between his fingers. But when asked to speak, he said simply, "Every runway is a limitation. I design freedom." The room went silent. When war broke out, NACA came under pressure to support the Navy and Army in developing new combat aircraft. Most research teams focused on high-speed aerodynamics. Only Zimmerman proposed a different path, an aircraft that could take off slowly, even fly backward. His proposal was submitted to the Department of the Navy in 1941, under the name Project V-173. On paper, it was a flat disc-shaped body with two massive counter-rotating propellers and a small cockpit in the center. When the design was first shown, an Air Force general scoffed, "It's not a plane, it's a pancake." The entire room burst into laughter. Zimmerman merely smiled and replied, "Then let's see if pancakes can fly." No one knew that line would become part of aviation history. According to records from the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics, Zimmerman worked an average of 14 hours per day, personally supervising every detail from the Continental A-80 engine joints to the 23 degrees wing angle ratio. Young engineers recalled that he often arrived before dawn, sitting on the concrete floor, watching the aircraft's body come together piece by piece. In a technical note dated July 1942, he wrote, "We must learn to rise vertically before we dream of speed." To him, speed was no longer the goal, it was merely the outcome of stability. But to be heard, Zimmerman had to battle not only physics but also military skepticism. When the Navy prioritized funding for the F-6F Hellcat and SB-2C Helldiver projects, his budget was cut twice. One advisor bluntly told him, "We are fighting a war, not chasing fantasies." Yet Zimmerman did not retreat. He carried his drawings from office to office, explaining again the principle of force transition. "It's not fantasy," he said, "it's necessity." In 1943, the V-173 prototype was completed, weighing 2,540 kilograms with a 7-meter wingspan. When it was rolled into the open for its first test at Aberdeen, those who had mocked him fell silent. They saw an object that defied every familiar law, part airplane, part helicopter. A small step in engineering, but a colossal tilt in human thinking. Charles Zimmerman became the man who tilted the sky, because he dared to tip the heavens away from their old limits. In his small room at Langley, surrounded by the smell of oil and the rhythm of hammers, he did not think he was creating a revolution. He was simply keeping a promise to the pilots who had fallen that one day humankind would take off not by luck, but by understanding how to truly leave the ground. The V-173 flying Pancake that Charles Zimmerman had dreamed of since 1941 finally became a reality, a structure so strange that even the assembly engineers admitted they were unsure whether it was an airplane or an airplane. Aerodynamic test rig. The disc-shaped body measured 23 feet in diameter, with two massive 16-feet propellers mounted at either end, spinning in opposite directions to cancel torque. The entire frame was made of plywood and canvas, lightweight, yet strong enough to withstand vertical lift forces. Beneath the thin shell were two Continental A80 engines, each producing 80 horsepower, bringing the total weight to 2.5 tons. According to records from the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics, 1942, Zimmerman designed the wing with a high lift-delta ratio, a nearly rounded triangular form meant to stabilize airflow around the body's edge. What made the V-173 unique lay in its operating mechanism. Instead of using forward velocity to generate lift, the two front propellers converted all energy into vertical thrust. When the propellers spun at 1,200 revolutions per minute, the downwash pressure against the disk's surface created a cushion of air that allowed the craft to rise without a runway. Once it reached an altitude of about 6 meters, the pilot would gradually tilt the aircraft's body, allowing lift to shift horizontally, transitioning into conventional forward flight. According to reports from the NACA Langley laboratory, the V-173 could maintain stability in crosswinds of up to 40 kilometers per hour, something nearly impossible for typical propeller aircraft. Those who witnessed the first test flights described the sight as a lost kite in the sky. From afar, the V-173 appeared almost motionless, its tail trembling slightly as the pilot adjusted the wing angles. It looked alive, engineer Boone Guyton wrote in his 1943 journal, as if it breathed through its propellers. For the first time, a fixed-wing craft achieved a near-hovering state without jet propulsion. But each breakthrough brought a new challenge. The two enormous propellers created such strong harmonic vibrations that the disc body shook constantly, causing the cockpit canopy to crack on the fifth test flight. Uneven pressure made the aircraft spin on its axis, sometimes tilting up to 25 degrees before the pilot could correct it. Observers believed the project had reached a dead end. Zimmerman disagreed. He returned to the Langley wind tunnel, remeasuring the wing angles millimeter by millimeter. After each crash, he increased or decreased the wing angle by 1 degree, fine-tuning the drive shaft and the propeller tilt mechanism. "We're not failing," he said. "We're measuring progress in degrees." From those adjustments, the tilt philosophy began to take shape. Zimmerman realized that if the entire aircraft body could tilt in the same direction as the propellers, the airflow would naturally stabilize during the transition from vertical to horizontal flight. This was the breakthrough that made the V-173 the foundation for an entirely new design, the Vought XF5U-1, the all-metal version of the flying Pancake. In 1944, when the XF5U-1 prototype was completed at the Vought plant in Connecticut, everyone understood it represented a leap far ahead of its time. The metal frame was lighter, yet 3 times stronger than the composite wood, the body coated in grey-painted aluminum alloy, with a wingspan of 8 meters, and equipped with 2 Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines producing 1,350 horsepower each. According to the Navy Bureau Report 1945 test data, the XF5U-1 was expected to reach a top speed of 550 km per hour, yet could fly as slowly as 32 km per hour without losing lift. Calculations showed its lift-to-weight ratio surpassed both the F-4F Wildcat and the P-40 Warhawk. When these figures were published, many officers began to realize Zimmerman was not a dreamer. The V-173 had been only the embryonic phase, while the XF5U-1 was the true embodiment of the vertical takeoff concept. To achieve stability at low speeds, he developed an off-center shaft mechanism that allowed the propellers to tilt with the wind, a concept later known as the variable pitch tilt wing. According to test engineer William Dunn, who operated the Langley wind tunnel, every adjustment changed everything. A 1-degree shift could mean a crash or perfect balance. That sentence captured the essence of Zimmerman's work, shaping the future 1 degree at a time. Amid hundreds of drawings and scale models, he realized his core philosophy lay not in the wings or engines, but in the mastery of transition, the phase between ascent and forward flight, where most aircraft failed. Zimmerman turned that understanding into a rule. He taught his students, "The air doesn't forgive impatience." Every modification had to be measured with patience. After nearly 200 hours of wind tunnel testing and 36 real-world takeoffs, the V-173 proved that the tilt concept could indeed work. By late 1945, as the war neared its end, the all-metal XF5U-1 rolled into the light, its disc-shaped silhouette reflecting the sunset across Vaught's test deck. The engineers stood silent, aware that they were witnessing the end of one era and the dawn of something entirely new. According to Joseph Adams, a Navy inspection officer, when it moved it felt unreal, like watching the future taxi down the runway. From the idea of 2 counter-rotating propellers, Zimmerman had forged the fundamental principle behind all later VTOL aircraft. Lift is not a question of speed, but of control. With every crash and every 1-degree adjustment, the history of vertical flight drew 1 step closer. In the Langley laboratory, amid the scent of oil and the hum of wind fans, the dream of a machine that could rise from the ground by the will of human ingenuity had finally taken form. On the morning of the 23rd of November, 1942, the sky above Langley Field, Virginia, was grey and dim, as if nature itself were holding its breath. On the runway, the V-173 flying Pancake rested silently among rows of onlookers. Engineer Charles Zimmerman stood beside the cockpit, clutching a worn notebook with frayed edges. Inside, test pilot Boone Guyton adjusted his leather cap, eyes fixed on the horizon. He had flown more than 30 different aircraft, yet he had never piloted anything shaped quite like this. 2 large, pale wooden propellers spanned nearly the entire width of the craft, and the flat, silver-painted disc reflected the faint light. "Ready when you are," Guyton said over the radio. Zimmerman nodded. The engines came alive first with a weak sputter, then with the deep, throaty roar of the 2 Continental A80 engines, each rated at 80 horsepower. The air pressure surged, kicking up dust and scattering papers across the test field. The propellers began to spin, the first rotations slow, then faster until those standing nearby shielded their faces. The craft shuddered, heavy and alive, like a creature waking from sleep. And then, the impossible happened, it lifted off the ground. According to the Naval Air Test Report 1943, the V-173 rose from the ground for approximately 14 seconds, reaching an altitude of 4.5 meters. Guyton held the control stick lightly, balancing the machine between two swirling air currents. It lifted like a kite, stable and gentle, he wrote after the flight. From the ground, Zimmerman watched, feeling every vibration of the engines as if it pulsed through his own body. No one spoke, only the sound of wind and propellers merged into a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. In those brief 14 seconds, the history of vertical flight opened its eyes. The V-173 made 3 more test flights that day. The second lasted 1 minute and 45 seconds, reaching a top speed of 222 kilometers per hour, and landed safely. During the final flight, Guyton deliberately throttled down at an altitude of 9 meters to see if the aircraft could maintain position. The result astonished everyone. The V-173 hovered almost motionless in strong wind, drifting only a few meters before stabilizing again. It felt like flying a feather that knew where it wanted to go, he recalled in a 1977 interview, his 60-year-old eyes still carrying the faith of that first day. The reaction from the US Navy spread quickly. The officers who had attended the test were both puzzled and intrigued. According to the Naval Aviation Evaluation Board, no aircraft has ever maintained position in wind so steadily. A young engineer wrote in his report, "This is a bird that doesn't need to run." In an era when aviation strategy revolved around speed and range, witnessing an aircraft nearly stand still in midair was a genuine shock. At first, the generals dismissed it as an eccentric experiment. But when they saw that the V-173 could land at an angle of nearly 25 degrees while remaining balanced, their attitudes began to shift. Zimmerman was invited to present in Washington at the beginning of 1943, where he displayed charts of lift vectors and aerodynamic trajectories. "We are not building a faster airplane," he said. "We are building a freer one." His words echoed through the smoke-filled room, and for a few seconds, all whispers ceased. According to records from NACA Langley Laboratory, within the next 6 months, the V-173 completed 131 test flights, totaling over 100 flight hours. Each one confirmed that the concept of vertical lift was no longer a fantasy. Zimmerman continued to record every variable meticulously: tilt angle, wind speed, and transition time between hover and forward flight. Each handwritten line marked a small but vital step in humanity's quest to leave the ground by will, not chance. When the article about the trials appeared in Scientific American in February 1943, scientists described the V-173 as a mechanical miracle with wings too short to fail. A photograph taken from below made it resemble a flying saucer, leading many to believe the military was developing a secret weapon. In truth, it was only the beginning of a dream. That same year, engineer Igor Sikorsky introduced the R-4 helicopter, the world's first mass-produced rotorcraft. According to the U.S. Army Air Force's technical report, the R-4 reached a top speed of 120 kilometers per hour and could take off vertically and hover for 10 minutes. Though they took different paths, Zimmerman and Sikorsky met at the same point the concept of vertical lift. One used fixed wings, the other rotors, but both proved that humankind had found a way to conquer the sky from a standstill. As dusk settled over Langley, the silver body of the V-173 rested quietly in its hangar. Zimmerman approached, placing his hand on the oil-scented surface. He could hear the wind outside whistling through the cracks in the door, a sound that recalled the moment the machine first left the ground. He murmured to himself, "It can hover. That's all I ever wanted." In the dim light, the numbers in his notebook still gleamed faintly proof that a mechanic's son, who once dreamed of tilting the sky, had truly done it. When the war ended in 1945, the engines of the V-173 fell silent, but the idea Charles Zimmerman had planted continued to spread like an undercurrent. In a time when the world was intoxicated by the thrill of the jet age, most propeller-based projects were shelved. Yet, in a small corner of the NACA Langley Laboratory, a few young engineers kept Zimmerman's original drawings. They called it the Hover Project. The disc-shaped body, short wings, and twin parallel drive shafts became the foundation of a new philosophy. Instead of flying the fastest, fly the most adaptable. According to NACA internal documents from 1946, all experimental data from the V-173 and XF-5U-1 were archived under the label Vertical Flight Research, a modest program that would profoundly influence the decades to come. When NACA transformed into NASA in 1958, Zimmerman's philosophy officially became part of the study of transition flight, the critical phase between vertical takeoff and forward flight. It was precisely the gap that global aviation had yet to bridge. In 1955, Ryan Aeronautical launched the XV-3 project, the first aircraft in history with rotors capable of tilting vertically. Building upon Zimmerman's lift equations and torque models, Ryan tested a narrow-wing frame powered by two Continental YT-53 engines, each producing 825 horsepower. During its test flight on the 11th of December 1958, the XV-3 reached a speed of 320 km per hour and successfully transitioned from vertical lift to horizontal flight. According to the U.S. Air Force Flight Research Division report, this was the first successful tilt-rotor transition ever recorded. In the 1,970 seconds, that idea was reborn in a modernized form, the Bell 15, combining tilting rotor technology with a lightweight composite airframe. The XV-15 could take off like a helicopter, reaching an altitude ceiling of 7,600 meters, a top speed of 510 kilometers per hour, and a range of 950 kilometers. Bell engineers nicknamed the project Zimmerman's Revenge. According to the NASA Ames Flight Test Summary 1978, the 15's automatic control system used stability algorithms derived directly from V-173 flight data collected in 1943. What was once dismissed as a wild dream had become a foundation of aerospace science. The arrival of the V-22 Osprey in 1989 marked the pinnacle of that journey. Developed jointly by Bell and Boeing, the project ushered in a new era of military aviation. The Osprey featured two Rolls-Royce T-406 engines, each generating 6,150 horsepower, with rotors 11.6 meters in diameter, capable of transitioning from hover to level flight in 12 seconds. According to the Department of Defense Operational Test Report, 2001, the Osprey achieved a speed of 509 kilometers per hour and a range of 1,600 kilometers, figures that Zimmerman had estimated in his Langley notebooks back in 1943. When engineers announced these results, one margin note was recorded. He predicted it before the war ended. The influence of the transition flight concept extended far beyond the United States. In 1969, the British company Hawker Siddeley introduced the Harrier jump jet, the world's first fighter capable of vertical takeoff and landing using jet thrust. The Harrier reached a top speed of 1,065 kilometers per hour, powered by a Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine capable of rotating its nozzles 90 degrees. According to the Royal Air Force Technical Review, the Harrier's control balance was influenced by American tilt flight data from the V-173 program. In the following decade, the Soviet Union developed the Yak-38 Forger, and France experimented with the Mirage 3, all built on the same principle. Instead of depending on runways, let aircraft command the sky on their own terms. By the 21st century, the technology had reached a new height with America's F-35B Lightning II. Entering service in 2015, the F-35B employed a lift fan system and a Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine, capable of switching from hover to cruise flight in 8 seconds. According to the Lockheed Martin Flight Performance Report, the aircraft reached a speed of 1,930 km per hour, a combat radius of 833 kilometers, and could take off from a deck only 150 meters long. Each time an F-35B lifted off in a shimmer of heat, the silhouette of the V-173 seemed to reappear the wooden disc that once trembled in the Maryland wind nearly 8 decades before. On a global scale, the take-off anywhere mindset became a strategic standard. The air forces of the UK, US, Japan, Italy, and South Korea all integrated vertical takeoff capability into their future combat programs. According to the NATO Aeronautical Strategy Paper 2018, vertical lift capability has redefined mobility, logistics, and rapid response in modern warfare. And at the end of that report, a line from Zimmerman's 1943 notes was quoted: "Freedom of flight means freedom from the ground." From a wooden and canvas prototype, the world had entered a jet-powered age capable of taking off anywhere. Every modern VTOL aircraft from the Harrier and Osprey to the F-35B carries within it the DNA of the flying Pancake. It is not merely a technical legacy, but proof of the enduring power of an idea born from perseverance. As the modern sky roars with jet engines, within that echo still lingers the hum of the old Continental motors, a reminder that the true revolution began with one man who believed the sky could tilt to human will. When the war ended, Charles Zimmerman quietly stepped away from the lights of the Langley testing room. The XF-5U-1 project, the metal version of the flying Pancake, was cancelled in 1947 as the world shifted toward the jet age. In the archives of Vought Aircraft in Connecticut, the disc-shaped plane gathered dust, its aluminum skin stained with oil, resting among broken frames and abandoned blueprints. There was no farewell ceremony, no newspaper tribute. In the frenzy for speed, people forgot the man who had dreamed of a different kind of flight, slower, precise, and free. Zimmerman was reassigned as a technical advisor for NACA, where he continued analyzing flight data. According to 1,952 records, he led the low-speed aerodynamics group, a paradox in an era obsessed with Mach 1 and Mach 2. Yet in that small room, he replanted the seed for a new generation of engineers, who affectionately called him the father of the short field. They knew that without his 1,943 drawings on vertical takeoff, the concept of VTOL vertical takeoff and landing would never have come to life. Zimmerman's students later became key specialists in NASA's experimental programs. When the Ryan 15-3 project emerged in 1955, many of his principles were revived. In the diary of Chief Engineer John Crane, a note read, "Zimmerman's data on lift vectors saved us months of calculation. The models once considered insane had become the mathematical foundations of the future. He no longer appeared at major conferences, but his name quietly lingered at the bottom of technical reports, a silent credit." According to Aviation Week, October 1962, when the Bell 15-3 completed its first transition flight, engineers invited Zimmerman to attend. He stood in the back row, in a smoke-filled room, as a 16mm film rolled. When the rotors slowly tilted from vertical to horizontal, the entire hall fell silent. A young man whispered, "That's his dream, right there." Zimmerman only smiled, saying nothing. When the lights came on, he quietly left, carrying with him a quiet joy few would ever recognize. In later years, his idea continued to live on in the Bell 15-15 and culminated in the V-22 Osprey, the first aircraft truly capable of taking off like a helicopter and flying as fast as a jet. The Osprey's successful test in 1989 reached a speed of 509 km per hour and a range of 1,600 kilometers. For the engineering world, it was undeniable proof that Zimmerman's 1,943 formula had been right all along. A Bell-Boeing engineer, at a presentation in Arlington in 2001, remarked, "Zimmerman built it on paper, we just gave it metal." In 2015, when the F-35B Lightning II performed its first vertical takeoff from the USS Wasp, American Defense Television broadcast the moment live. The footage showed the 27-ton jet slowly rising through waves of heat before transitioning smoothly into level flight. In the CNN defense report, the commentator exclaimed, "Zimmerman's dream finally stood on its own wings." The dream once mocked had become a tactical standard of the 21st century. Though little known to the public, Zimmerman's influence runs deep in modern aeronautical thought. He left behind a philosophy both simple and profound. Speed is power, but control is freedom. According to Joseph Adams, his former colleague at Langley, Zimmerman never raised his voice in meetings, he simply proved his point with numbers. Whenever challenged, he would pick up a piece of chalk and write on the board, If a bird can hover, so can we. Many recalled that in his later years, he kept the habit of arriving at the lab at dawn, making coffee, sitting before the scale model of the V-173 on his desk, as if conversing with the past. Zimmerman left no will. His greatest possessions were hundreds of pages of notebooks filled with formulas, drawings, and a few letters to old friends. In one letter from 1964, he wrote, "If we can't rise straight up, maybe we never truly understood what lift means." For him, lift was no longer a physical term. It was a symbol of the human spirit's will to rise above its limits. It is said that during a small memorial service at McLean Church in 1996, a former NASA engineer read that line aloud, his voice breaking at the word, "Rise." Behind the podium, the wooden model of the V-173 sat on a glass pedestal, reflecting the warm light like a beating heart. Zimmerman's story is a lesson in courage within a skeptical world. He sought no fame, he only believed in his work. Generations of engineers have since called him a symbol of engineering faith, the conviction that allows humans to transcend fear. Every great invention begins with a question that makes others laugh. Zimmerman asked his question in the midst of World War II, and the answer arrived nearly half a century after his death. Today, when F-35Bs and V-22 Ospreys lift off from small decks in the open sea, few remember that it all began with a wooden pancake in Maryland. Yet in every vertical takeoff, in every rush of air against metal, that original dream still echoes the dream of humankind to fly without running. According to the Smithsonian Air and Space Archives, the fuselage of the V-173 is still preserved in a museum in Dallas, beside a small plaque engraved with the words, "The impossible lift that endured." If this story makes you believe that impossible is only temporary, take a moment to look back at history. Today's wings were not born of luck, but of faith. Faith from a man once called mad. A trembling wooden aircraft in 1943 began an entire era of free flight. And if you ever doubt the power of an idea, remember Charles Zimmerman, the man who made the sky tilt to lift humanity higher. As this story closes, the sky remains where humans once fought not only to survive, but to prove that ideas could soar higher than bombs. In war, there were men like Charles Zimmerman, who never held a gun but helped shape the future through intellect and faith. Those dreams were born amid fire, fear, and the resilience of a generation that dared to think differently. Have you lived through war years, or heard your parents and grandparents speak of them? Do you remember the smell of smoke, the sound of wind, or the silence after the sirens? If this story stirs a memory of loss, courage, or simply the belief that humanity can still rise after ruin, leave us a follow. Share your story in the comments. Tell us how you or your family lived through war. Every story told is a way to keep the past from fading. May stories like this continue to spread, so that future generations understand that technology, courage, and faith were born from those brutal years. Your single, small as it is, helps keep these memories alive so that those who once dared to dream in wartime will never be forgotten.